testimony you have made to your own excellent temperaments. FrackingSENSE, I should remind you, is our co-sponsors for FrackingSENSE are the Boulder County Commissioners and staff, and FrackingSENSE is one part of a big project funded by the National Science Foundation Sustainability Initiative. We have one more FrackingSENSE speaker in 2013 after tonight. Denver attorney Howard Boygan will be our speaker, and he will draw on years of frontline experience to reflect on, quote, tradition and innovation in the oil and gas industry. He will be contrasting the ways in which this industry leads the world in adaptability and originality in technology, and also contrasting those ways with the ways in which the industry sometimes resists change and holds on to old customs that may soon be outdated if they are not already outdated. So, tell your friends who are not your equals in toughness and hardiness that they should make a point of checking the Southern American West website in order to listen to the podcast or watch the video of tonight's presentation. And now for my familiar remarks about the series, which some of you have been coming regularly, can now chant along with me. For FrackingSENSE 2.0, we are inviting our speakers to offer evidence-based findings that might lead to recommendations and prescriptions for the future. We have asked our speakers to demonstrate how they weigh evidence, evaluate conflicting studies, and appraise contradictory claims, in other words, to model critical thinking performed live. Tonight has a wonderful feature in my judgment because our speaker has actually written the terms of this invitation into the title for his talk. We don't know if he is the only one who actually read my letter, but there's something very heartening about having you respond to that invitation. Not that the others have not also given it a good shot too, but the range of opinions expressed in this series make it essential for us to abide by the recognition that people come to hear these talks, and we must do everything we can to make sure that the capacity to hear the speaker remains uninterrupted. So if you find yourself in deep disagreement with a spoken statement at any point in the series, we encourage you to use what the Southern American West designates and endorses as respiratory protest. You can sigh deeply and bitterly, you can snort skeptically, and you can even hiss quietly if your feelings are very strong. The Southern American West does, however, discourage the form of hostile commentary conveyed by snoring, which is very unlikely to be a problem tonight, and really any other time in our series. Now, I think that's extremely funny, but not everyone has to agree with me on that. We did discuss whether harumph is in the range of respiratory protest, but it is not, because it is a spoken remark. So, we will follow our custom of written questions, since that custom delivers the excellent feature of allowing me to make sure that every single question gets asked and also gives us a record of the audience's interests and concerns. So during the talk, people from the Southern American West will walk around the room distributing more of the little sheets you will find in your program and collecting questions and delivering them to me. When they deliver those to me, I will be momentarily demoralized and intimidated by the number of questions I must read and arrange and categorize, and then I will recover my confidence and prepare myself to present them to the speaker. Set of people will continue walking around during the question and answer period, collecting questions that come to your mind during the speaker's responses. Please feel comfortable about asking questions that you worry might be too dumb. It has almost always been my experience that when I myself ask a question that I thought was too dumb to ask, several people afterward come up and say to me, "Thank you for asking that. I thought I was the only one who did not know the answer." So tonight I am very glad that we are turning to the crucial issues and case studies of energy development in tribal communities, an important feature of the whole big picture of energy development, a feature that does not always receive the attention that would be proportionate to its importance. Our speaker tonight is Robert J. Martin. He is an enrolled member of the Makah Indian tribe in the state of Washington. He holds a law degree from George Washington University. He has had 3 decades of experience in tribal energy and environmental affairs. He was the former director of law, policy, and governance for the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, and he was also the former national ombudsman for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under 3 presidents, and that has to be one of the least restful positions that a person could hold in life. It certainly stressed for me how much I enjoy being an armchair quarterback. I remarked on that. He said yes, indeed, he has been out on the field and not in the armchair quarterback state. He's investigated issues at sites ranging from the World Trade Center to the proposed Yucca Mountain nuclear waste disposal site and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. So we're very fortunate to have a speaker of such wide-ranging and intense experience Very fortunate to have him bring his knowledge and insight to bear on the subject matter of this series. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to present to you Robert Martin speaking on hydraulic fracturing on tribal lands, a weight of the evidence approach.
There. Can you hear me? Okay. I have the microphone on. I'm not accustomed to talking with a microphone. I usually just talk. And, if you can't hear me, I talk louder, but I guess that's for the sake of a better video recording of our session this evening. Thank you, Patty, for having me, and my good friend and colleague, John Echohawk, for recommending I come. Glad to be here and visit and share some of my own prior experience with this issue, not only in Indian country, but as Patty noted, the former National Ombudsman of the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. And I can assure you in that capacity, I sat with folks all over the country and have done hearings 12 to 15 hours long, and everyone got to talk, and we didn't close the doors until everyone did, and every question was answered. And so I don't shy from whatever folks have to say or whatever your facial expression may be with what's discussed. That's all fine, that's all well and good. Yeah, so my title for this evening, and I'm trying to make it as concise as possible, is Hydraulic Fracturing in Indian Country, a weight of the evidence approach. And I'd like to explicate that a bit for you. I think we just parse it out first, and I think we could start with what hydraulic fracturing is, okay? I found it useful to look at a couple definitions. The definition offered by the Department of Energy, the Federal Department of Energy, a couple years ago, was a technology used to recover oil and natural gas from underground, low permeability rock formations. Interesting that it assumes low permeability, but nonetheless, that's DOE's definition. An industry definition that's been referenced is a specific technology to stimulate oil and natural gas production from a formation, period. Okay. And there has been some controversy about whether it's FRACK or FRAC. It's just fracking. Okay. To be determined yet is what sovereign tribal governments construe hydraulic fracturing to mean. There are not a lot of tribal codes out there that address the issue at this time. There are rules which have been proposed by the Obama administration through the Department of the Interior to apply to not only public lands, but also Indian lands throughout the United States. Those have been out there now for public comment for about a year. I think, well, they say anywhere between tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of comments have been lodged with the department. The rules have not yet been made final, but it's expected that they will become final imminently. So that could be this month, or it could be at the beginning of 2014. Those rules will have their own definition of hydraulic fracturing and how it's to be addressed on both public and Indian lands. What is Indian lands? What is Indian country? It used to be a term that was fairly flexible going back to colonial times, anywhere to the west that was populated by tribes and not by non-tribal people. But in our evolving history, it's come to have a more precise meaning. And now it means all lands within the limits of any Indian reservation in the United States, and all dependent Indian communities in the United States, and something known as allotments as well, which are smaller pieces of ground or property that used to be part of the reservation but are now owned by a tribal member directly. So that's the definition of Indian country. What's that mean? practically? Well, practically it means that there are about 565 federally recognized Indian tribes throughout the United States, comprising approximately 57 million acres of ground. That's still a pretty good chunk of real estate in the United States. Of that 57 million acres, approximately 15 million acres contain energy resources of one kind or another. That can be oil or gas or coal or uranium, geothermal sources such as that. Only 2.1 million acres of the 15 million acres that contain such energy resources are now in any kind of state of production. Okay? So even though there's a lot of land out there that has a resource to be used, it's not all under development right now. What's the scope of the asset? What's that mean? What's the scope of the energy asset? Well, Indian tribes own 3% of known United States oil and gas reserves. That comes out to about, in terms of natural gas, a minimum of 25 billion cubic feet of natural gas, which lies within Indian territory or Indian country. 10% of the coal of the United States is owned by tribes. Of that, 30% of the coal west of the Mississippi is owned by tribes. 40% of the uranium in the United States is owned by tribes, mostly in the Southwest. 10% of estimated United States renewable sources of energy are also within Indian country. The total value of just the hard, quote-unquote, hard tribal energy assets, oil, gas, coal, and whatnot, has been estimated at $1.5 trillion. So it's a significant energy asset. What's a weight of the evidence approach? Okay, you've heard a little bit about me. Now you've heard a definition of hydraulic fracturing, and you've heard about what Indian country is in fairly broad brush. Okay, what's a weight of the evidence approach to looking at all that? Well, it's an approach which I used during my tenure at the Environmental Protection Agency. As Patty noted, having served as National Ombudsman, I dealt with things as they came to me. And part of the way you deal with them, of course, is scientifically, but you don't often have the benefit of waiting until definitive studies have been concluded and all the data is in and there are no disagreements or controversies anymore. I mean, far from it. Whenever I undertook a case or an investigation, the environmental issues and controversy was usually raging between different parties at a site somewhere in the United States. Typically it happened to be a very large site and a very large controversy. So how do you deal with that? I found the weight of the evidence approach to be useful, and here's why. Weight of the evidence means a balance or a preponderance of evidence. It's otherwise known as the greater amount of credible evidence. You can look at that legally. I often looked at it practically. Okay, this kind of approach also resonates with the way EPA does business as a matter of science and technology, because it has been used by the agency, for example, in the past, I don't know how many years, 10, 20. It's been used in what's known as the endocrine disruptors screening guidance. It's a very complex health and scientific issue where the agency had to evaluate the effect of chemicals on people and how those chemicals can disrupt or affect people's endocrine systems. How do you do that? Well, there's medical science, there's various technologies, there's genetics, there's just all kinds of things. Okay, so the agency finds it useful to use a weight of the evidence approach. A little bit more arcane, but it may appeal to some folks. Here at the university, a weight of the evidence approach may also be used to support what's known as extrapolation domain analysis. That is where you identify a geographic area that appears suitable for adoption of innovative ecosystem management. And if there was ever a field or an issue for which that kind of approach could be useful, I think it's hydraulic fracturing because of the amount of ground it covers, not only in Indian country, but even in this state, in the communities in this state. Our communities are part of ecosystems, and it would be a good thing, I think, to use this approach. So that is the approach in any event which I have chosen to use. When you do that, you weigh the totality of the evidence, okay? The totality of data. You don't so much pick and choose to start with. You take whatever's out there, whatever you can get your hands on, frankly, and you weigh its credibility. You bring it all in, okay? And there are various sources of data that we can look at to review the state of hydraulic fracturing in Indian country. The first is resource data. You know, as we noted a moment ago, that tribes possess a minimum of 3 to 5% of the natural gas in the United States, and the same amount, if not more, of oil. In fact, oil reserves owned by tribes have been estimated at about 10% of the United States total. To give you some specific points, the Hickory Apache tribe down in northern New Mexico has been in the oil and gas business now for about 60 years. They have 3,000 active or plugged wells. They have 2,000 miles of gathering pipelines for natural gas, and that kind of gas development covers about 1/3 of the reservation. So they have been very active. So have the Northern Ute tribe, the Untan-Array Reservation in northeastern Utah, just on the Colorado border. They've been in the business about 75 years. They have 7,000 wells. They produce 900 million cubic feet of natural gas. Okay. Let's look at production data as another source of data or information to review as part of a weight of the evidence look. There are at this time about 500,000 oil and gas wells in the United States. 92,000 of those wells are on public or tribal lands, BLM or tribal lands. 92,000. 90% of all those wells, not only the 92,000 but the 500,000, are produced using hydraulic fracturing. 90%. So it's a very prevalent recovery technology for oil and gas. The rules that are out there right now from the Obama administration through the Department of the Interior, therefore, affect 15% of all the oil and gas wells in the United States at this time, but 100% of tribal wells. Oil and gas production through shale gas formations has tripled between the years 2007 and 2010. The Department of Energy estimates that 30% of United States energy needs will be met by gas the end of 2011. In 2005, the United States imported 60% of all the oil it consumed. In 2011, that dropped to less than 50%, and that has been attributed to gas production through hydraulic fracturing. The United States is pumping, therefore, about 7.9 million barrels of oil a day, which is up more than 50% since 2006, and that's the greatest increase in production in 25 years. So this is part of any weight of the evidence review, what's going on out there as far as the extent of the resource, what's going on out there as far as the state of production. Let's look at economic data as well as part of a weight of the evidence review. Now, while tribal hard energy assets have been valued at 1.5 trillion. Tribal incomes or Indian incomes as compared to non-Indian incomes are 1/3. So Indian folks, when they work and make a paycheck, only get 1/3 of what non-Indians get. That is an economic reality on reservations that goes into a review of the evidence. Unemployment on reservations is 5 times that of the national average, still, at a minimum. So these facts matter as well in any kind of review because they represent pressures on elected officials to make something happen as far as economic development. The International Energy Agency, moving to a higher level, forecasts output for oil outside of OPEC to increase 1.8 million barrels a day in the year 2014, in the next year, okay? A half of that increase outside of OPEC will come from the United States for the first time. So the United States is moving towards becoming an energy exporter as opposed to an energy importer. And tribes may be a significant part of that equation as it changes. More so, the financial markets are getting used to cheap gas from shale formations, even though the price of that gas has gone down and has remained down, okay? The price per cubic foot of gas on the markets has varied between $2 and $4 over the past 3 years. Nonetheless, production of gas keeps going up. And that's an odd relationship because usually when the prices get depressed, the production cuts back, but not in this case. So the US economy is becoming dependent on this kind of gas production domestically through hydraulic fracturing. Another example of this is that gas-powered power plants have increased their market share to 30%. It used to be 21% in 2008. They're getting a larger share of the power generation market. They're taking that from coal-fired power plants. Okay, so that's another indicator of the economic importance of the gas boom, so to speak, through hydraulic fracturing. That's all well and good to talk about money and to talk about the extent of the resource and how much it's being produced. Let's look at some environmental data, which has to go at least hand in hand with any weight of the evidence review of these other matters. There is a study which has been commissioned by the Obama administration. It's to be done jointly between the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, the United States Geological Survey, and the Department of the Interior to determine the environmental risks of developing shale gas. Okay. The first draft of this study is due at the end of 2014. The final version of the study is to be finished after President Obama finishes his term. It will be done in 2016. Okay? Now, these kinds of studies should never be downplayed. They're important. Nonetheless, when I saw this, it reminded me a lot of the old studies I used to see when I was at the agency. There was one important study known as a dioxin reassessment, where the agency was reassessing how badly dioxin was harming people's health, frankly, as a chemical of concern. And it was supposed to be done in a couple years. Well, I think it took 12 years to get it done. So such studies are important for their depth and for their coverage and for what they're aligned to accomplish. But you know, as health and environmental issues, other issues have to be dealt with along the way. As I said earlier, you don't always have the luxury of waiting for the definitive study, in this case through these agencies, is completed. In fact, it won't be completed during this term of the president. So we need more immediate information and evidence with which to deal. We need incremental knowledge, okay, as we grapple with these things in communities, to build what I call the end product of a weight of the evidence approach, and that is a working hypothesis. I mean, you know, what do you do at the end of the day? You know, you can scratch your head and say, I just don't know enough. Or you can say, well, I know what I know. And we need to know more, and here's where we need to go. And here's what the evidence tells us in a working hypothesis. So that is what I think, you know, a weight of the evidence approach achieves along the way, and I think that's important. Here are some things that could fold themselves into that kind of approach and contribute to a working hypothesis. You've got to look at what's out there, at least I used to when I did this. So, you know, there have been a few things done over the last few years by the EPA and by other agencies. There was a study of groundwater done just north in a town called Pavilion, Wyoming. And that study, I think, was well on its way. There were objections, I think, the day after some preliminary findings were released from the state of Wyoming. And there was some back and forth between the agency and other entities, like there usually is. Did you do it right? Did you do it right? Did you check your work and all that? And those are legitimate questions, but what wound up happening there, I think, was that the study was kicked over to the state to be finished, I think, by the end of next year, or maybe the fall of next year. And you know, that's okay, assuming it contributes to the body of knowledge and what we need to be dealing with here. There are, I am sure, findings which were made in the Pavilion analysis that would help understand how to approach this problem. So I think to that extent it goes into a weight of the evidence review. Secondly, there was an action taken by EPA in a little place called Dimock, Pennsylvania. The agency did something I'm very familiar with. They wrote what's called an action memorandum. And action memorandums are written under Section 104A of the Superfund law. And start getting into acronyms here and all that, but that's the law to attack abandoned waste sites and real nasty hazardous substance problems that people face in their communities. So EPA in Dimock, Pennsylvania issued an action memorandum to deal with what they saw as contamination from hydraulic fracturing operations in that community. Usually the agency would not do such a thing unless they had some kind of body of evidence and some technical findings that would warrant doing what's called a removal action under Superfund. And removal actions are important because it allows the government to move immediately, okay? You don't have to wait. There's a problem, it's been identified, there are facts to support the existence of the problem, you go out and deal with it. And usually what's known as an on-scene coordinator is dispatched by EPA to go right into the place and take charge and decide what needs to be done to address the problem. This went down the road a little ways, I think, and then the agency decided that there were no continuing grounds to warrant the removal or the action by the agency in Dimock, Pennsylvania. Nonetheless, I don't think the agency issued that kind of order capriciously. So I am sure there is a body of evidence there that could be used to contribute to an overall weight of the evidence review. There was another action taken by EPA in a place called Parker County, Texas, where there were hydraulic fracturing operations. The EPA Regional Office, EPA Region 6, issued what's known as an imminent and substantial endangerment order. And that was done under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. to address methane contamination, releases of methane gas from hydraulic fracturing operations in Parker County, Texas. I can state, I think fairly reliably, that EPA does not often issue imminent and substantial endangerment orders. It's a very, very rare thing. I think during my entire 10-year tenure at EPA, it was done once. Okay? So again, there's a body of evidence there, I think, that should be folded in to any review of how to deal with some of the issues around hydraulic fracturing. There's a lot of terms of art here in hydraulic fracturing, as I found, just reviewing the matter briefly. There's something called flowback waters. A lot of water is used to bring up gas from the low permeability rocks. And when that comes back up to the surface after it's been used down below to free up the gas, it's known as flowback water. And it can contain a number of things. It can certainly contain the chemicals that were used to facilitate the fracturing of the low permeability rocks. Okay? What do you do with that water when it comes back up? Well, if you're going to dispose of the water, if the oil and gas operator is going to dispose of the water, let's say in a surface body of water, you've got to get a permit under the Clean Water Act to do that. It's known as an NPDES permit, National Pollution Elimination Discharge System permit. Or if you don't want to do that, if they don't want to do that, then they can discharge it to what's known as a POTW, Publicly Owned Treatment Works, which is your typical water and sewage system in most communities. The problem with that is most of those facilities aren't geared to take the kind of things that are in this flowback water and process them through efficiently. Let's just say that, okay? So there was another study done in a small town in Pennsylvania to look at what was coming out in this flowback water through the publicly owned treatment works of a small town. Well, high concentrations of bromides were found. Salts, in other words, the salinity of the water was 200 times higher than that allowed by the Clean Water Act. Radium was found at 200 times higher in sediments. Okay? Now those are preliminary findings from this study. I should be careful to note that each study has its own limits and maybe its own faults, so there have been rejoinders to that study that, well, maybe you tested too close to the outfall of the plant, maybe you should have gone over here, you should have gone over there. Well, okay, but again, this goes into a working body, I think, of knowledge that you take in as a totality and review its credibility. So, there's also been a study by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that found 55%, I think, of the volatile organic compounds, they're known as VOCs, stuff in the air, in ground level ozone in a place just down the road called Erie, were caused, they think, by hydraulic fracturing activities. Well, that's a fairly good percentage of the total that could be attributed to hydraulic fracturing activity. Now, that may change, that may go down over time because of different things that are happening in the federal government and the state government. There's something called green completions that oil and gas well operators are now required to do for gas, not oil, that bring down the amount of VOCs and methane and things like that that are emitted from these wells. So maybe it's going down, but nonetheless, I think broadly these studies are finding spikes in concentrations of VOCs, spikes in ozone non-attainment. Ozone is a whole other thing, but it happens usually in metropolitan areas, such as this one. For example, I think they found in San Antonio, Texas, that the ozone concentrations had spiked markedly in 3 years. I think from 2008 to 2011. And there's no direct causal link yet, but there, has been some talk of maybe that's parallel to the development of the Eagle Formation in Texas. So these are things to be watched, noted, and validated. Health data. There are about 750 chemicals known to be used in hydraulic fracturing. I think at least 29 of those are potential carcinogens as determined by the EPA, or hazardous air pollutants as determined by EPA under the Clean Air Act. Those can include such things as methanol, ethylene glycol, xylene, naphthalene, benzene. They're all part of that family. There has been some study which shows that cancer from benzene exposure may, if you're living right next to a well, okay, which some people I guess are, in the range of 10 in a million for residences and 6 in a million in other circumstances. Now, as a point of context there, under Superfund, the point of departure, quote unquote, and that's a term of art in EPA, the point of departure at which you start worrying about people getting cancer is what's known as 10 to the minus 6 mathematically. So you're getting close. You're getting close, okay, for such exposures. There was also a study by this university in a place called Garfield County that showed living next to wells that were using hydraulic fracturing as a technology, and they were in the middle of well completion and had some uncontrolled flow back of water, increased the risk of neurological and respiratory diseases, okay? And that was a review done for the years 2008 through 2010. Now again, that may mitigate or lessen over time because of green completions, quote unquote. EPA issued rules in August of 2012 requiring green completions for gas wells. By 2015, that applies to oil wells as well. It does not apply to such things as wildcatting or exploratory wells or what they call delineation wells, where they're just trying to get the parameters or the boundaries of an oil field. Those things are exempted. But this at least is on the books from EPA as of August of 2012. Finally, operations data. I mean, how does this translate? How does this work, on site? It has to be any part of any review. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, otherwise known as NIOSH, who I used to work with closely, had a voluntary safety stand down for the oil and gas industry on November 14th to review safety measures, because every 3 days in the past almost 3 years, 2010, 2011, and 2012, an oil and gas worker has been killed on the job. Non-fatal accidents to oil and gas workers jumped from 1,400 in 2011 to a 5-year high of 2,600 in the last year. So they're going up. There's also a trend among oil field workers for deaths among older workers, more falls from heights of derricks, more fires and more explosions, okay? So the oil and gas industry has some pretty stringent on-the-job rules. That's a good thing. But given the level of production and how much it's being relied upon, those need to become even more stringent. As the NIOSH said, they have a little acronym that they call DRT. A DRT injury occurring to an oil worker is what they call dead right there. Because when you have those kinds of accidents and injuries, you don't usually walk away from them. So, you know, in this field, they want stringent to become even more stringent. And I think that has to go into any review as well of the technology and how it's deployed. That leads to a working hypothesis. So back to Indian country and the whole approach, and what does this data tell us, and you know, how do we apply it given all the things that are happening right now, okay? Given the fact that the tribal energy asset base is so lucrative, given the fact that poverty on reservations is so, you know, rampant, given the fact that the United States appears to need this energy production to have national energy security, okay? Given the fact that the Obama administration has proposed rules to apply to not only public lands, otherwise known as Bureau of Land Management lands, but Indian lands as well. As we noted earlier, 100% of production on Indian lands will be governed by these rules. So I'd like to posit a few elements of a working hypothesis to address this matter. First, Indian tribes and public lands are just not the same, okay? We are not trees and rocks. We are sovereign peoples and governments. So we expect to be dealt with as such. And there's a whole history of legal cases, acts of Congress, and frankly our own standing firm to support that. And at least in my view, that's got to be an initial come from in working out this problem. The Department of the Interior has said that these rules to apply to public lands and Indian lands provide what they call a consistent oversight and disclosure model. Well, that's models that are, you know, consistent are usually very good things. You want them. That may work well for the Bureau of Land Management lands, but it may fail without the proper approach on tribal lands, because the relationship of the federal government to things it protects is different to Indian tribes it protects. There is a fiduciary relationship that exists between the United States and Indian country. It's known as the trust relationship. So whatever happens has to be based on the fact that we are different and that there is a fiduciary relationship in place. Another placeholder that I think has to go into a working hypothesis is that just reciting our laws is not enough. The administration and the Department of the Interior must respect a broader regulatory scheme that is already in place for Indian country. Indian tribes have been recognized by the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, as co-environmental managers for purposes of water protection, air protection, environmental protection. And this has to be also a bedrock, I think, of any working hypothesis to address energy production on tribal lands and protection of tribal lands from hydraulic fracturing. I think that tribes have demonstrated over the long term that they can be trusted with striking a good balance between environmental protection and economic development. We feel that these kinds of things need to be balanced for the long term. You've heard seventh generation, well, we believe it. Long-term thinking is supported by this kind of sustainable thinking. And also, I think, a weight of the evidence approach also supports that. So what we really need to move forward, I think, is more like a bridge strategy. And I think it's based on a weight of the evidence approach in Indian country. It goes beyond keeping hydraulic fracturing just as is, okay? There's a a camp that says, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, can we ask if it's broke? Can we talk about if it's broke? Can, you know, we look hard and see if it's broke, because those things need to happen if you really care about the long-term history of the tribe and its welfare. Okay. By the same token, just saying it can't ever happen at all, well, there are tribes who have said that, and their decisions must be respected. You know, for example, the Turtle Mountain Chippewa tribe appears to have banned fracking completely, like I think the community of Lafayette has. And that decision, because it's made by a sovereign, must be respected. Okay? But not every tribe is going to do that. There are as many tribes who say, no, we just need to develop the resource because we have an impoverished economy and we waited too long and we just can't wait any longer. Okay? That would be more like the 3 affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold in North Dakota and some others. I think what we need in the end is to strike that balance much better. The Wind River Reservation up in Wyoming, right next to, I guess, the community of Pavilion, has said, you know, we believe in economic development and energy development, but we also believe in protecting our lands and our people for the long term. Let us find the appropriate balance. So I think as we go forward, those become the principles of any good working hypothesis, supported by the data, and by credible reviews of that data in an ongoing way, not waiting for studies that may take many, many years, because, you know, I don't know, some folks don't have many, many years. You got to deal with things as they are now. So that's what I have to share with you tonight, and sorry if it's been a little longer than expected, but thank you, and I look forward to your questions. So.
Okay, I'm starting with some questions on groundwater issues, and I'll start with what chemical analyses should be used on water samples to assess it, to see if hydraulic fracturing has impacted groundwater. So groundwater, the person is wondering about chlorinated solutions, which ones, VOCs, and so on. So what to look for.
Okay. So I guess, you know, the rephrase, what chemical approach should be used to determine whether there's a problem in groundwater. Well, you know, one of the more important things you got to look at is what's known as a pathway of exposure. There's typically a kind of a 3-part test that appears simplistic, but always used it as: 1 is there a contaminant? 2, is there a pathway of exposure for that contaminant to reach people? 3, if it is such a thing and it's reached people, what does that mean? What is, you know, the toxicological profile of that contaminant? What's it going to do once it reaches people? So the middle of that, the second prong of that test, I think comes into play with the chemical analyses. You have to look at the geologic formation and determine, for example, if it's truly low permeability or high permeability. You can do that through what's known as dye trace tests. You inject dye into the formation and watch it wind its way through, and, you know, you'll see where it goes. That's the whole idea. So there, it gets you to the answer first of, if something is bad, can it get through to people? Can it get through to an aquifer or, you know, a drinking water source? Once you've determined that, then I think you step backwards a little bit, and there's a test known as a T-clip test, toxicity characteristics, leaching, it's been a while, leaching profile, but it was used under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act to gauge what a hazardous substance is. Okay, so you can look at something and go, okay, does this pass the T-clip test or not pass the T-clip test? Because if it doesn't pass, you've got you got a hazardous substance, okay, and now what do you do? So those are some of the things practically that you apply. So,
What role does the age or the era of creation of a well have to do with the likelihood of its contaminating groundwater due to hydraulic fracturing?
all right, let me rephrase and think as I stand here. What role does the age of a well have to do with the likelihood of its contaminating?
Yes.
Well, that goes to the physical integrity of the well. I suppose common sense can tell us, like anything, the older something gets, the more prone it can be to erode or break down or whatnot, and that comes down to well casings, which are generally made of concrete, steel. I mean, so what's the lifetime of those materials? Have you reached the lifetime of those materials given the age of the well? The older it gets, I think you're probably a little more prone to failure. So,
I know about that.
okay.
Personal aging
Yeah.
structures are certainly true, and many other structures besides wells. This person is clarifying that you said that drillers must get permits before dumping wastewater into surface water. Since the oil and gas industry is exempt from the Clean Water Act, why must drillers get permission before disposing of wastewater into waterways?
Well, I think here's where you get into some of the fine tuning of to what extent these activities are covered or not covered by the federal environmental laws. The industry received an exemption from the Congress for purposes of the Safe Drinking Water Act back in 2005, and that's been a bit controversial ever since that time. But it provides that they are exempt from these particular kinds of fracking operations are exempt, except those that use diesel. Those are not exempt, okay? And EPA in the last year has been working on a rule to determine what diesel means, for example. It can mean 5 or 6 different things. This is where it gets into the minutia of each environmental law that applies, to this kind of activity. And flowback waters are a little different than waters that go and stay under the ground. Okay, so flowback waters, I think you've got to get. I could be wrong. I think you've got to get an NPDES permit, or you put it into the publicly owned treatment works, or you use a more innovative on-site treatment of the flowback water to clean it up. So it's one of the three.
Okay, we're getting now to issues, particularly tribal matters. So we have like 3 people with some version of, do tribes generally own mineral rights as well as surface land? What control over the mineral estate can tribal entities exercise? What is their regulatory authority? So 3 folks converging on that.
All right, let me see if I got that. Can tribes or do tribes own mineral rights?
Do they own the mineral rights? Do they generally own the mineral rights? And what regulatory authority can they exercise over mineral development?
Yes, they generally own the mineral rights. However, there are situations on reservations where that's true, but on the other hand, it's flipped. So somebody else may own a subsurface mineral right on a reservation. It can be a non-Indian, it can be an allotment owner, like a tribal owner, an individual Indian. It depends, and it can be a patchwork on some reservations. Just like in the context of some non-Indian lands here, folks woke up and found, they own the farm, but they don't own underneath the farm. Somebody else does. So.
Regulatory authority.
There is regulatory authority by the tribe in several ways. One is inherent tribal sovereignty. There's that kind of authority. Secondly, there's authority delegated from the federal government. So a tribe can exercise jurisdiction through delegation from the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, different environmental programs.
Okay. How has flowback water affected tribes in which fracking is taking place, if it has at all?
I confess not to know, directly there. I think it's been a concern, on different reservations, but I don't know to what extent by tribe.
A little bit in the same spirit, have there been documented cases of environmental or human health injury from fracking activities on reservation land or Indian land?
I don't know in particular. I do know that there have been documented oil field injuries from tribal operations.
So, are Native Americans protesting fracturing on their reservations, and if so, in which states? Are they protesting because of health concerns or other matters?
Well, I think, it's been fairly well published that there have been demonstrations by various First Nations in Canada against proposed hydraulic fracturing operations. Those have been made not only out of concern for the land, but also out of concern for the health of the members and the long-term sustainability of the tribe or the First Nation. So it's been pretty strong up in Canada. Down here in the United States, it's been a little bit more of a mix. There are some tribes that have favored more development using hydraulic fracturing on their reservations, such as Fort Berthold in North Dakota, in Untaunaré in Utah. But there have been tribes, as I noted earlier, that have just said we don't want it, like Turtle Mountain, Chippewa. There have been tribes who say, would like to strike a good balance. There'll be Wind River. The Blackfeet Reservation up in Montana has gone back and forth to awarding some leases and then putting them on hold, I think, because they're right next to Glacier National Park. So.
Here's a very broadcast question. Do you propose that hydraulic fracturing should be banned?
No, I don't know enough yet. That's the whole purpose of the way they have its approach. Yeah.
Okay. And then here's one that I jumped over, what should have been in there with the not so tribal questions. What exactly were the EPA's findings in Parker County, Texas that led to such an extreme order? What happened or what actions were taken as a result of this order, and where does this stand today?
Very good, specific question. I don't know personally, but I do know the nature of the order, and it's usually issued when there's a very tangible threat and danger to human life and health, right in a very discrete place, okay? And it's present. It's not contemplated, not maybe, not potential. It's happening. So that is why that order is issued, and that's why it's such a rare thing.
Okay, this one we may need a little help from the author. Maybe you used the word departure, and I was thinking for a moment here. Have you seen any areas get to the point of departure yet? And by that, departure...
I think I know what the questioner is referring to. I made a note about what's known as a point of departure under the Superfund law, and that's actually a term of art in the National Contingency Plan, which supports the Superfund law. And what that means is once there's a certain level of exposure that causes cancer to so many people in a million, that's a point of departure for the agency. Then they go, okay, we got to leave now and do something about this. We have to go to the next step and do further investigation. So.
What can we learn from this example of the Southern Utes and the Red Willow Corporation, Permanent Fund, etc.?
Well, without knowing a whole lot directly, I guess we could certainly learn how to invest because they have brought themselves up very well through their corporation and have gone from a state of impoverishment to a very well-endowed development fund for the nation for long term. So.
What did the Council of Energy Resource Tribes do, and with what impact?
Well, it's been around for almost 40 years. organized for the first time every tribe that owned an energy resource, so that I think a federal court actually said it operates as a League of Nations, as an Indian League of Nations, doing together what no one tribe could do for itself. So I guess you could say strength in numbers, so that we couldn't get picked off, one by one, by industry or, for that matter, anybody else.
So I'm always given one question of my own here, which is, since you have worked with the federal government and also been engaged with tribes, the issues of jurisdiction, where authority should be, what authority should be with the federal government, what authority should be with the state government, what should be with counties, what should be with cities, that's obviously very up in the air now. So your thoughts about those jurisdictional questions, but especially how would thinking of the tribes and that distinctive sovereignty illuminate or give us an insight or a perspective on that issue of jurisdiction?
Well, I've found Google searches to be very illuminating as I get older, and I also find Wiki to be very illuminating, Wikipedia. So if you look up, I think government in the United States, it basically says there's the federal government, there's the state governments, and there's Indian tribes. And most people don't think like that. Okay, well, there's the United States and then there's the states, but not a lot of people think of Indian tribes. Well, Wiki, I think, laid it out pretty well. So, any approach to any problem has to include all sovereigns, and that includes Indian tribes.
Okay, and then the last question. Could the Indians' understanding and knowledge of their lands be better integrated with the natural resource development of their lands, or is that already the case? Could it assist, could development on reservations of these energy resources assist in creating jobs? What sort of work with the scientific community and academics would be imaginable for making the most of those resources in a way that is compatible with Indian traditional understandings and knowledge?
Well, it's kind of a mouthful.
Yes.
I'll do my best.
Yeah.
I think that, to put a framework around it, that could refer to indigenous knowledge of, the environment. And there is now more of a placeholder for that knowledge in the federal government and in general, and EPA in particular. That had not been the case for many years. We'd often had Western or non-Indian frameworks of understanding imposed on tribal indigenous knowledge, and we're told, that the Western approach is empirical and therefore correct. Your approach is non-empirical and therefore incorrect. So, you don't count. And we're going to use our own methodologies, whether it's in risk assessment or different areas, and we'll tell you what the result is. And I think there's been more of an opening up in the past 10 years. Certainly EPA is using more indigenous knowledge, and as is USGS. They're finding that tribes' history, oral history or whatnot, for example, of geologic events and climactic events, is very valid and lends to the body of understanding for where you go from here. So did not have much of a place in the past, has more of a place now, and should continue to have that place.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.